The grizzly came out of nowhere, and by the time Elias Cole hit the ground with 3 deep claw marks carved from his shoulder to his hip, there was no one left on that mountain trail but him, the bear, and God. The year was 1874, deep in the heart of the Colorado Rockies, when the Western Territories were still a wild and untamed country, full of men who lived and died by the land and the seasons. The fur trade had thinned out from its peak, but trappers and mountain men still made their lives in the high places, setting lines along frozen creeks and hauling pelts down to the trading posts in Pueblo or Denver before the snows came too heavy to travel. Elias Cole was one of those men, and he had been one for the better part of 12 years, ever since he had left his father's farm in Missouri at the age of 20 with nothing but a good knife, a rifle that had belonged to his grandfather, and an unshakable need to see what was on the other side of every ridge. He was 32 now, and the mountains had shaped him the way rivers shape stone, slowly and without mercy. He stood well over 6 feet tall, built through the chest and shoulders in the way that only years of hauling, climbing, and surviving could build a man. His arms were thick with muscle from trapping in frozen streams and carrying loads that would have broken lesser men, and his hands were rough and scarred in a dozen places. He wore his dark hair long to his collar and sometimes past it, because there was never anyone up in the high country to tell him otherwise, and he had a jaw that looked as though it had been cut from the same granite as the peaks around him. He was not a handsome man in the way that men in suits and parlors were handsome. He was handsome in the way that a thunderstorm is handsome, something you could not look away from, something that made you feel very small and very alive at the same time. He had been working a line of traps along the upper reaches of the Arkansas River drainage that September, cutting south and east along a trail that would eventually bring him down out of the mountains and into the foothills near the small settlement of Ridgecrest. It was a town he had passed through a handful of times over the years, never staying more than a night or two, just long enough to trade, resupply, and drink a glass of something that was not river water, before heading back up into the places where he felt most like himself. The morning the Grizzly found him had started out as fine a morning as September in Colorado could produce. The aspen trees had already gone gold, and they shivered in the high wind like sheets of hammered coin. The sky above the peaks was the deep and serious blue that only comes at altitude, and Elias had been in good spirits, his pack loaded with a decent early-season haul, and his mind already loosely organized around the plan to reach Ridgecrest before the first hard frost. He had come around a bend in the trail where it narrowed between a rock face on one side and a dense stand of spruce on the other, and that was where the Grizzly was. She was not hunting him. That was the cruelest part of it, and a part that Elias would think about later with a kind of grim appreciation for the randomness of disaster. She was a sow, and she had 2 cubs somewhere back in those spruce trees, and Elias had simply walked around a blind corner and appeared directly in her path at a distance of perhaps 15 feet. She did what any grizzly sow with cubs will do when something large and surprising appears between her and her young. She came at him before he could raise the rifle. The first swipe took him off his feet entirely. The second caught him across the back and side as he went down, and those were the 3 deep furrows that would later be described by the doctor in Ridgecrest as the worst set of bear wounds he had treated in 20 years of Western medicine. Elias hit the ground hard, face down in the dirt of the trail, and he lay still, which was the only reason he was still breathing. The sow stood over him for a long and terrible moment, her breath hot on the back of his neck, and then she turned and went back into the spruce trees to her cubs, and she was gone. He lay there for a long time after that, not sure if he was alive or in the process of dying, listening to his own blood dripping into the dry trail dust and to the distant shivering of the aspen leaves. He knew he was badly hurt. He knew the wounds across his back and shoulder were deep because he could feel a wrongness there that was beyond ordinary pain, a vast and spreading cold where there should have been heat. He had lost his pack when he went down, and his rifle was somewhere off to the side, and when he tried to push himself up with his arms, only one of them worked properly, which told him something important about the damage done to his shoulder. He managed to get himself onto his side, then slowly onto his knees, and then with a sound that he would have been embarrassed to make in front of another person, he got himself onto his feet. He was bleeding badly, He could feel it running down his back and soaking the back of his trousers, and he knew that if he stood still and waited for the bleeding to slow, it would likely not slow fast enough to matter. He was perhaps 8 miles from Ridgecrest by the trail, less if he cut straight down the eastern slope and crossed the meadows below the tree line. He was not going to make it 8 miles on this trail bleeding the way he was bleeding. He picked up his rifle because the rifle was a part of him and he would not leave it, and he started walking. He did not know how long he walked before the world began to tilt. The sun had moved, which meant time had passed, but he had lost the ability to calculate how much. The blood had slowed at some point, which was either a good sign or the worst sign, because wounds that stop bleeding can stop for more than one reason. His legs were still working, which he was grateful for in a distant and already slightly detached way, as though he were watching himself from some small height above the trail. He followed the trail downward, putting one foot in front of the other, with the kind of stubborn mechanical persistence that the mountains had put into him over 12 years, the same persistence that made him rebuild a washed-out camp or reset a trap line in a blizzard, the persistence that was really just another word for refusing to lie down and let the land take you. He made it approximately 5 miles before he did not make it any further. The trail came out of the trees at that point and ran along the edge of a long, open meadow. And in the meadow there was a wagon track that connected Ridgecrest to the higher grazing pastures where some of the cattlemen kept summer stock. He made it to the edge of the meadow, and then his legs stopped cooperating, and he went down on one knee, and then both knees, and then he was on his hands and knees in the dry September grass at the edge of the meadow, and the blue sky above him was spinning slowly like a compass that had lost its north. He was still conscious. That was something. He was conscious enough to know that if he lay down here in this meadow, the odds of anyone finding him before the coyotes did were not in his favor. But he was also conscious enough to know that he did not have the ability to stand up again without something to hold on to. And there was nothing to hold on to. He stayed on his hands and knees and breathed, and the breathing was not good either, a wet and labored sound that he did not like hearing from himself. And he looked out across the meadow at the wagon track and the long yellow grass and the distant line of cottonwood trees that marked where the creek ran. And he thought with a clarity that sometimes comes in the extremes of things that it was a very fine view to be looking at. That was when he heard the wagon. He did not hear it for long before he saw it, a small covered wagon coming along the track from the direction of the high pastures, pulled by 2 dark horses at a steady walking pace. It was still perhaps a quarter mile away, but Elias had lived his whole adult life in country where a quarter mile was nothing, where distances meant only the time between one thing and the next. He did not shout, because he did not have the lungs for it. He did the only thing he could do. He stayed on his hands and knees in the grass at the edge of the meadow where he could be seen. And he waited. The wagon came on. Nora Alcott was 24 years old, and she was not supposed to be on this trail by herself. She was supposed to have been married 3 weeks ago. The wedding had been arranged the previous spring between her father, Thomas Alcott, who ran a small dry goods store in Ridgecrest, and a man named Gerald Marsh, who owned a substantial piece of grazing land to the northwest of town, and who had decided at the age of 41 that he needed a wife to manage his household and provide him with children to inherit what he was building. Nora had not been consulted in the manner that a woman in a different time or place might expect to be consulted, but she was not entirely opposed to the arrangement either, because Gerald Marsh was not a cruel man, and the alternative was to spend the rest of her life in her father's house, measuring out flour and salt for the neighbors. But Gerald Marsh had ridden out to check on his northern fence line in late August, and had been thrown from his horse when the animal stepped in a prairie dog hole, and he had broken his neck, and he was dead before anyone found him. And Nora Alcott had found herself in the peculiar and not entirely explicable position of mourning a man she had not yet married and did not yet love, while also quietly contending with the knowledge that her situation had become rather complicated. Her father was not an unkind man, but he was a practical one, and he had already been in conversation with 2 other men in the territory about the possibility of another arrangement. Nora did not have strong feelings about either of them. She had, over the course of that strange and untethered September, been spending more time than was perhaps wise in solitary activity, driving the wagon up to the high pastures under the pretext of collecting the supplies that Gerald Marsh had stored there, and which now, by some confusion of the estate, her father seemed to think he had a claim to. Mostly she drove the wagon up to be alone, to think, to look at the mountains and feel something other than the slow and grinding frustration of being a woman in 1874 whose future was being arranged by other people while she sat in the store and measured out flour. She was coming back down the wagon track that September afternoon, the wagon loaded with blankets and a few crates that her father had sent her for, when she saw something at the edge of the meadow that made her pull back on the reins. At first, she thought it was an animal, a large dog perhaps, or a deer that had gone down with an injury. And then the shape of it resolved into something that was unmistakably human, a large man on his hands and knees in the long grass, his head hanging down, and she could see even from this distance that something was very wrong. She did not hesitate. That was the thing about Nora Alcott that most people in Ridgecrest did not know, because she was quiet and she was small, 5 feet and 3 inches, with dark hair and dark eyes and a face that was composed in its expressions, in the way that people who have learned early to keep their feelings private learn to compose themselves. She was described by most of the people who knew her as gentle, which was accurate, but it was also incomplete, the way that calling a river gentle when it is calm does not describe what that same river is capable of when conditions change. What Nora had, and had always had, was a kind of calm and steady competence in a crisis that she had never needed to explain to herself because she had simply always had it. She drove the wagon straight across the meadow to where the man was kneeling, and she had her brakes set and was down from the wagon seat before the horses had fully stopped. She came around the side of the horses and stopped a few feet from him, and even in the first moment of seeing him up close, she registered several things simultaneously. He was enormous, broader and taller even on his knees than most men standing. His hair was dark and hanging forward around his face, and his shirt was soaked through with blood across his entire back, the fabric so saturated that it had gone almost black. There were 3 parallel tears in the shirt that told her exactly what had made them. She had grown up in the mountains, and she knew what bear claws did to fabric and flesh. "Can you hear me?" she said, and her voice came out very steady, which was exactly what she intended. His head came up slowly. His eyes were dark, dark brown, almost black, and they focused on her face with a visible effort. He had a jaw like carved stone and eyes that were, even in their current considerably diminished state, deeply and uncomfortably alert. "I can hear you," he said. His voice was rough and low, the voice of a man who spent more time talking to the mountains than to other people, but there was still substance to it. He was still in there. "You've been mauled by a bear," she said. "Yes," he said, as though she had simply confirmed a fact he had been considering. "Can you stand if I help you?" He considered this with the seriousness of a man who was not going to give her false information. "Maybe," he said, "partially. I need to get you into the wagon. I'm taking you to Dr. Haynes in Ridgecrest. We're about 3 miles from town." She paused, then added, because she thought he needed to understand the importance of this, "You have to help me as much as you can, because I cannot lift you by myself." Something shifted in his expression, a faint and rueful acknowledgement of the absurdity of the situation. "That's fair," he said. She braced herself beside him, tucking herself under his good arm, his left arm, and he got his feet under him, and it cost him tremendously. She could feel the effort of it in the way his whole body shook and the way his breath went ragged, but he got upright. He was, on his feet, about 8 inches taller than she was, and the weight of his arm across her shoulders was significant, but Nora set her feet and bore it. "The wagon," she said. "The wagon," he agreed, and they started toward it. Getting him into the wagon was not simple. The wagon bed was not high, but high enough to matter, and by the time he was in it, lying on his side on the blankets she had spread out, his face had gone a color that frightened her. She pulled the blankets over him and climbed back onto the seat and turned the horses around. "What is your name?" she called back to him as she put the horses into a trot. There was a pause, and she thought for a moment that he had lost consciousness. Then, "Elias Cole." "I am Nora Alcott," she said. "You are going to be all right, Mr. Cole. I need you to stay awake." "I'll do my best," he said. And then, after another pause, quieter, as though he was saying it more to himself than to her. "Thank you, Miss Alcott." She drove those 3 miles to Ridgecrest faster than she had ever driven them, and she did not slow for the bumps and she did not slow for the ruts, and she talked to him the whole way, not always about anything in particular, sometimes just observations about what she was passing, the cottonwood trees along the creek, the condition of the road, the way the afternoon light was sitting on the mountains to the west. She talked to keep him tethered to the world, and she talked because it was the only tool she had, and she intended to use every tool available to her. He answered occasionally. Not much, and not in complete sentences toward the end, but he answered, and she counted each answer as a small victory. She drove the wagon straight down Ridgecrest's main street at a pace that brought people to their windows, and she pulled up in front of Dr. Haynes's office and did not bother climbing down before she called out for help at the top of her lungs, which was something that Nora Alcott had never done in her life, and which therefore brought 4 men out of the surrounding buildings very quickly. Dr. Edmund Haynes was a small man of 55 with careful eyes and hands that did not shake, and when he came out to the wagon and looked at the man in the back, he looked at Nora and said, "How long?" "He was mauled on the mountain. I found him in the meadow above the marsh property. I would estimate he had been there at least an hour before I found him, and it has been perhaps 40 minutes since." "He's alive," Haynes said, and it was not a question, but it had the quality of one. "He is alive, and he was speaking to me until about 10 minutes ago." "Good." Haynes turned to the men who had gathered. "Get him inside, carefully." Nora stood in the street and watched them carry Elias Cole into the doctor's office, and it was only when the door closed behind them that she allowed herself to feel the thing that she had not allowed herself to feel on the drive down, which was a cold and thorough terror at how close that man had come to dying in the long September grass, and how easily she might have taken a different road home. She unsaddled the horses and watered them at the trough, and then she sat on the bench outside the doctor's office, and she waited. Her father found her there an hour later, because Ridgecrest was a small town and news moved through it quickly, and Thomas Alcott was a thin man of 50 with a worried face and the perpetual air of someone calculating something. "I heard you brought in a trapper," he said, sitting beside her. "A mountain man," she said. "Elias Cole. He was attacked by a grizzly on the high trail." "You should not have been up that trail alone, Nora." "I know," she said, in the tone that meant she acknowledged having heard the words without agreeing with the sentiment. "Is he going to survive?" "Dr. Haynes hasn't come out yet." Thomas Alcott was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You did right, bringing him in." Nora did not say anything to that. Dr. Haynes came out 2 hours after Nora had arrived, wiping his hands on a towel, and his expression was the careful, neutral expression of a man who had learned not to show families what he was feeling until he had decided what to tell them. "He'll live," he said. "It's not a certainty, but it's a likelihood. The wounds are deep, but they're clean. The bear's claws didn't open anything that isn't already sutured. He's lost a great deal of blood, and the wound across his right shoulder has damaged some of the muscle, and whether he regains full function there remains to be seen. He will need rest, and he will need someone to watch for the fever." Nora stood up. "Can he stay here?" Haynes tilted his head slightly, considering the question. "I only have the one back room, and I have 2 other patients at present. I don't have the space." "He can stay at our house," Nora said. Her father turned to look at her. "We have the spare room," she said to her father. "It would not be right to leave him without anyone to see to him." "Nora," her father said, "he nearly died, father. He has no one here." She looked at Dr. Haynes. "What will he need?" Haynes gave her a long look, the look of a man assessing something. Then he said, "Fresh dressings every 2 days. Watch his temperature. Clean water and whatever broth or food he can take. Keep him still as long as possible, which will likely be a challenge." He paused. "He is a strong man, Miss Alcott. That is the best thing he has going for him. Men built like that tend to survive things that would kill others." She nodded. "We will bring him in the morning." Her father was quiet the entire walk home, and at dinner he said, "People will talk." "People always talk," Nora said. "It does not change what is right to do." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he picked up his fork, and the conversation was over. She brought Elias Cole to the Alcott house the following morning in the same wagon, this time padded with every blanket she owned and driven at a pace that could only be described as deliberately gentle. He was conscious when they moved him, conscious and extremely unhappy about the state of his ability to move under his own power, and he said so. "I can walk," he said in the doctor's office when the two men who had agreed to help were preparing to carry him to the wagon. "You cannot," Dr. Haynes said. "I walked 5 miles with these wounds," Elias said, in the voice of a man making a factual statement. "And very nearly killed yourself doing it," Haynes said. "You will be carried. This is not a debate." Elias Cole looked at Nora Alcott from his position on the cot, a look that had in it something that was part exasperation and part a grudging acknowledgement that the man was correct, and Nora looked back at him with an expression that she worked to keep neutral, because what it actually contained was the memory of those 3 miles on the wagon, counting his answers like lifelines. "Allow it," she said quietly. He allowed it. She noticed that he did not like allowing it, but he did. She put him in the spare room, which was at the back of the house, and had a single window that looked out onto the small kitchen garden, and beyond that, to the foothills rising toward the mountains. She brought him water and the broth she had set on the stove before dawn, and she showed him where the chamber pot was without embarrassment, because there was no room for that kind of embarrassment in practical nursing, and she changed his dressings that first afternoon with careful hands and the steady face she had learned to wear. The wounds were ugly. She had seen injuries before, had helped her mother nurse a neighbor through a wagon accident when she was 14, and she had assisted Dr. Haynes once with a man who had taken a knife in the side, but these were different. The 3 furrows ran from the back of his right shoulder, down across his back and around to his left hip, deep enough in places to make her breath catch, the edges red and tight from Haynes's suturing. She worked as quickly and as gently as she could, and she did not talk more than was necessary, because he was clearly in considerable pain, and sometimes the most considerate thing you can do for a person in pain is not to require anything from them. When she was done, he said, "You have good hands." She looked up at him. He was watching her over his shoulder with those dark eyes, and there was something in the look that was genuine and without performance. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it," he said. "Most people tighten up when they're trying to be careful. You don't." She began gathering the used dressing materials. "I don't have a great deal of patience for my own hands being unsteady," she said. A faint sound came from him that might, in a man who was in less pain, have been a laugh. "Fair enough," he said. She came twice daily for the first week, morning and evening, to change his dressings and bring his food and check his temperature, which climbed on the second day and made her do everything she had told herself she would do calmly in an organized and efficient manner, which was to go to Dr. Haynes and describe the fever precisely, and follow his instructions precisely, and sit in the chair beside the bed through a significant portion of that night with a basin of cool water and a cloth, keeping the fever from climbing further. The fever broke on the 3rd day, which was when she finally slept a full night. During those first days, he slept a great deal, and she was glad for it, because sleep was the thing that was going to repair him. But he was not by nature a man who slept well when he was confined, and by the end of the first week, he was awake more than he was asleep, and the window that looked out at the foothills had become, she noticed, something he looked at very often. She came in on the 8th morning to find him sitting up in bed with his legs over the side, and she stood in the doorway with the tray and said, "No." He looked at her. "I was just sitting up." "I can see that. I can also see that you were considering standing up, and you are not ready to stand up." He had the expression of a man who was not accustomed to being told what he was or was not ready to do. "I've been on my back for 8 days, he said. "You have been healing for 8 days, she said. "There is a difference." She came in and set the tray on the small table and helped him turn so that his back was against the headboard, which was better than having him hang his legs off the side. "Dr. Haynes will come this afternoon. You can argue about standing up with him." Elias was quiet while she arranged the tray on his lap. Then he said, "You've been here every morning and every evening." "Yes," she said, sitting in the chair. "You have other things to do." "I also have this," she said simply. "Eat your breakfast, Mr. Cole." He ate his breakfast, and she sat in the chair, and the silence between them was comfortable in the way that silence between two people who were beginning, cautiously, to be at ease with each other, can be comfortable. "How did you end up out here?" he asked, "in Ridgecrest?" "My father opened his store here in 1866. I've been here since I was 14. He looked at the window. "You're from the East?" "Ohio," she said. "We came out on a wagon train." "Did you want to come?" The question surprised her, because most people did not ask that. "No," she said honestly. "I was 14 and I had friends in Ohio, and I did not want to leave them. But I came, and I stopped wanting to have not come somewhere around the second year. The mountains are hard to resent once you've actually lived near them." He smiled at that. It was the first genuine smile she had seen on his face, and it changed the geometry of it considerably, the serious hard angles softening into something unexpectedly warm. "That's true," he said. "I came out from Missouri thinking it was adventure. Took about a year before I understood it wasn't adventure. It's just life, just a different kind." "Do you have family in Missouri?" "A brother," he said. "We write when I'm in town long enough to receive a letter. He has a farm. He has a wife and 3 children." Something crossed his face that was not quite sadness and not quite longing, but was adjacent to both. "He's built something real." "So have you," she said. "A different kind of real." He looked at her. "You don't know what I've built." "No," she agreed. "But you're still alive to build more of it, which is not a small thing given what happened to you 8 days ago." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's also true." Doctor Haynes came that afternoon and examined the wounds and declared himself cautiously optimistic, and he allowed Elias to stand for the first time, carefully and briefly, with Nora standing close on his left side in case he needed it. He did not need it, but when he was standing and looking out the window at the foothills with a particular expression on his face, something between relief and hunger, she stood beside him and looked at the same view, and the late afternoon light came through the glass and lay across both of them. 3 weeks, Haynes said. "Perhaps 4 before you should be doing anything strenuous. The wounds need more time than the pain suggests." Elias received this news with the expression of a man receiving a longer prison sentence than expected. Then he looked at Nora, and she looked back at him steadily, and he said, "All right." The days settled into a rhythm after that. Nora came in the mornings and the evenings, and increasingly she found herself staying longer than the care of his wounds required. They talked. That was the simplest way to say it, and the most accurate. They talked the way that 2 people who have been waiting, without knowing it, for someone they could actually talk to, will talk when they finally find each other, with a kind of slightly dazzled thoroughness, following ideas and stories from one to the next without any particular agenda. He told her about the mountains with the specificity and love of a man for whom they were home, the names of the passes and peaks, the behavior of animals in different seasons, the particular quality of light in the high country in December when the snow was fresh. He told her about the trapping life without romanticizing it and without being falsely modest about it either, the brutal cold and the hard work alongside the freedom and the beauty and the way that kind of life stripped everything down to what was essential. She told him about Ridgecrest, the small details and the larger ones, the politics of the town meetings and the stories of the people, who was generous and who was not, what had changed since she had been a girl and what had stayed the same. She told him about her mother, who had died of fever 3 years ago, and she told him about Gerald Marsh without particularly planning to, the wedding that had not happened, and the strange in-between state she had been living in since. He listened to the Gerald Marsh part without interrupting, which was the right thing to do, and then he said, "And your father has other arrangements in mind." "He does," she said. "He means well. He's worried about my future." "Are you?" She considered that. "I am more concerned with living than with planning," she said. "That is probably not a practical attitude." "It is the only sensible one," he said, and the firmness of it surprised her. She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression that was careful and direct and completely without pity, which was what she needed, and had not known she needed. "You have been very kind to me," he said. "More than kind. I would not be alive without you." "I was not going to leave you in that meadow," she said. "No," he said. "I know." I could see that about you in the first minute. He paused. What I mean is that the way you've been here, every day, you didn't have to do that part. I wanted to, she said, and heard in her own voice the simple truth of it. Something changed between them in that moment, subtle and significant, the way pressure changes before weather comes, and Nora was not a woman who deceived herself about such things. She stood up and collected the tea things and said goodnight with her usual composure, and she was very quiet walking across the house to her own room, and she sat on the edge of her bed for a while in the dark and thought about what she was feeling, with the same clear-eyed honesty that she tried to bring to everything. What she was feeling was not gratitude, though she was grateful for many things. It was not obligation, though obligation had started it. It was something warmer and more inconvenient than either of those things, something that had been building quietly for days in the space between morning and evening visits, in the conversations and the silences, and the way he looked at her with those dark eyes as though she were the most genuinely interesting thing he had seen in a long time. She was in trouble, she thought, and then she thought that trouble was not entirely the right word for it. Outside on the main street, the town of Ridgecrest went about its evening business, horses and wagons and the smell of wood smoke from a dozen chimneys, and the mountains to the west were dark shapes against a sky that was going from deep blue to black, enormous and patient and completely indifferent to the small human calculations being made in the house below them. By the second week, Elias was walking around the room, and by the third, he was walking in the kitchen garden, slowly and with a deliberateness that told her he was still managing pain that he did not talk about. She watched him from the kitchen window sometimes, watched the way he moved through the garden rows with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the mountains in the way a man looks at a place he loves and cannot go to yet. She brought him coffee one morning in the garden, and they stood beside the garden fence together with their cups, and the air had the cold, clean smell of a Colorado October, and the aspen on the distant slopes had gone fully gold. "I need to get back up there before the first hard snow," he said. "I have traps set that I can't leave." "When does the first hard snow come?" He looked at the sky, reading it the way she read a letter, the long, practiced fluency of a man who had spent 12 years making decisions based on what the sky was telling him. 4 weeks, maybe 5. The signs are late this year. Dr. Haynes said 4 weeks before strenuous activity. "The timing is workable," he said, which was either optimism or the kind of deliberate arithmetic of a man who had already decided. She looked at him. He was clean-shaven now, which she had helped with in the first week when he could not manage it himself, and which had been its own kind of complicated intimacy. And his dark hair was still long, touching his collar, and he was still thinner than he should be from the blood loss and the weeks of limited food. But the weight of his shoulders and the solid reality of him were coming back. He would be going back to the mountains when he was healed enough, and that was what he was supposed to do, and she had no claim on him that would make it otherwise. She was thinking about this in a way she was trying to keep private when he said, without looking at her, "I would like to come back to Ridgecrest." She looked at him. He turned from the mountains to look at her, and there was something in his expression that was not uncertainty exactly, but was the thing just before certainty, the moment of choosing. "When I come back down in the spring, I would like to come back here," she held his gaze. "To see Dr. Haynes." "No," he said, "to see you." The October air moved between them, cold and clear, carrying the smell of dried leaves and wood smoke. "That would be all right," she said quietly. The corner of his mouth moved. "Just all right?" "That would be very welcome," she said, and smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind she did not give lightly, and she saw what it did to his expression when it landed. Her father came into the kitchen garden that afternoon, the way he sometimes did when he had been thinking about something long enough to have decided to say it, and he looked at Elias Cole standing by the fence in the autumn light, and he looked at his daughter, and he was quiet for a long moment. "I want to speak with you," he said to Elias Cole. Elias turned from the fence. He was a full head taller than Thomas Alcott and considerably broader, and he regarded the older man with a respect that was real and not performed. "Yes, sir," he said. "Inside," Thomas said. Nora watched them go inside, and she stood in the garden with her coffee cup and looked at the mountains. and she was not nervous, because she was not a woman who was nervous about things she could not control. She was patient, which was not the same thing. The conversation inside lasted 20 minutes. She did not try to listen. When they came out, her father's expression was the expression of a man who had not gotten exactly what he wanted, but had gotten something he could work with, and Elias Cole's expression was careful and slightly formal in the way of a man who has been asked to be patient about something important. He looked at her and said, "Your father has asked me to speak with him again when I return in the spring." She looked at her father. Thomas Alcott had the look of a man who was making a calculated risk. "A mountain man is not what I had planned," he said. "But then, the plan has not been working out as anticipated." He paused. "He is an honest man. I will give him that." "He is," Nora agreed. Thomas went back inside, and Nora looked at Elias, and Elias looked at Nora, and they were both quiet for a moment in the way of people who have just had something decided about them by other people and are finding the terms acceptable. "Come spring," she said. "Come spring," he agreed, "though the winter is going to be considerably longer than any winter I can remember." She laughed, quietly, and the sound of it in the cold October air surprised her with its ease. How natural it felt. How right. He left on a Monday in mid-October, 8 days before the first hard snow of the season came, howling down from the north with the kind of conviction that reminded everyone in Ridgecrest why the mountains were not entirely friendly. He left with his pack, his rifle, and the wounds along his back nearly fully healed on the outside, though still tender. And he left on a horse that Tom Alcott had offered him, a solid roan gelding named Fletcher, because Elias Cole, walking up a mountain trail 8 miles back to his camp, was not a thing that Thomas Alcott was going to allow, regardless of his feelings about mountain men as potential sons-in-law. Nora came out onto the porch to see him off. He sat the horse well, naturally, the way men who spend their lives outdoors sit animals, and he looked down at her from that height, and the October morning light was doing things to the angles of his face that she thought she would need to remember carefully. "Be careful," she said. "I will," he said. And then, with a seriousness that was his particular kind of tenderness, "Take care of yourself, Nora." It was the first time he had used her first name without the miss in front of it. She stood on the porch and watched him ride until the road curved and the stand of cottonwoods took him. And then she went inside and started the bread that needed making, and she did not permit herself to be maudlin about it because there was no sense in that. He would come back. She knew it with the same certainty she knew the mountains would still be there in the spring, the same certainty with which she knew her own mind. What followed was a Ridgecrest winter, which was a particular kind of winter, not as brutal as the high country, but enough to require serious management with the wood supply and the store and the endless small negotiations of a small town contracting around its fires while the cold lasted. Nora helped her father in the store through the long months, measuring and wrapping and keeping the accounts, and she attended the twice-monthly social gatherings that Ridgecrest organized in the winter, because human beings needed to see each other, or they went strange. And she was civil to the 2 men her father had been in conversation with, both of whom continued to express interest, and she was honest with herself about the fact that she was not interested in either of them, not even slightly. She wrote one letter to Elias in November, addressed to the trading post in Pueblo, where he had told her he received his mail in the winter months when he came down from the heights. She wrote about the first snow and about the store, and about a dispute between 2 neighbors that had occupied the whole town for 3 weeks and been resolved by the unlikely intervention of the pastor's wife. She wrote it in the voice of a woman writing to a man she intended to see again and whose intelligence she respected, and she reread it once before she sent it and decided it said what she meant. His letter came in December, 8 pages, which surprised her because she had not expected 8 pages from a man who spent his days in physical work in the wilderness. And then she thought that she should not have been surprised at all, because she knew by then how his mind worked. He wrote about the high country with the same specificity and love she had heard in his voice, described the first heavy snows and the behavior of the animals and the particular silence of the mountains in deep winter, a silence he described as the loudest silence he knew. He wrote about his trapping and about a cabin he wintered in some 20 miles above Ridgecrest, a good solid structure he had built himself 3 years prior, and which he described with a kind of unself-conscious pride. He wrote, near the end of the letter, that winter had never before felt long to him, and that this winter was already the longest he could remember. She read that last part twice. Then she folded the letter carefully and put it in the small box in her nightstand, where she kept the things that mattered. Another letter came in February, shorter, from Pueblo, where he had gone down to trade. He asked about her father. He asked about the town. He said the winter was breaking early on the southern slopes and that he expected to be moving back toward Ridgecrest before anyone was reasonably expecting him. She replied the same day. He arrived on a Thursday at the end of March, which was earlier than most people in Ridgecrest had expected anyone to be coming down out of the high country, but not earlier than Nora had expected, because she had read his letter about the early spring with the attention of a woman who had been counting the weeks and was therefore familiar with their implications. She was in the store when she heard the sound of a horse on the road that she somehow already knew, and she came out to the porch of the store and looked down the main street, and there he was. He looked healthy. That was the first thing she noticed, and it flooded her with something she had not named as worry until it was replaced by its opposite. He had regained all the weight and more, the broad solidity of him back in full, and he sat the horse with that natural ease, and when he saw her on the porch, his face did something that was not complicated at all. He rode up to the store and dismounted, and she came down the steps, and they stood in the March mud of Ridgecrest's main street, looking at each other. "You're early," she said. "Spring came early," he said. "The letter said as much." "Yes," he said, and then, "You look well. You look considerably better than the last time I saw you in person," she said. He smiled, the wide, genuine one, the one that changed his whole face, and she felt it through her whole chest. "I spoke with your father," he said. "I wrote to him in February. I asked his permission to call on you properly." She had not known about the letter. "And?" He said yes, with conditions. "Of course he did," she said. "They're fair conditions," Elias said. "He wants to know I intend to stay in the area, that I'm not going to take you somewhere he'll never see you." "And do you?" she asked directly, which was the only way she knew to ask things. "Intend to stay in the area?" He looked at her steadily. "I've been thinking about that all winter," he said. "I've been thinking that a man can trap from a base as well as from a camp if the base is close enough to the mountains. And I've been thinking that I am 32 years old, and there are things I want that I have been telling myself I don't need for long enough." The March wind moved between them, cold and sharp and carrying the smell of the thaw. "What things?" she said, though she thought she knew. "A home," he said simply. "Someone to come back to." He looked at her. "You." She was quiet for a moment, not from uncertainty but from the fullness of it, the way a person will be still when something they have been waiting for finally arrives. "I would like that," she said, and her voice was even and warm and entirely sure. He exhaled, and she saw in the release of it how much he had been holding. "Good," he said, with a roughness in his voice that was feeling, not gruffness. Thomas Alcott came out of the store at that moment, summoned by either instinct or having been watching from the window, and he looked at Elias Cole and then at his daughter, and he said, "You'd better come in and have coffee then." The spring that followed was the deliberate and beautiful construction of something real. Elias settled at the edge of town at first, boarding with the Garvey family on the south side of Ridgecrest, and he called on Nora in the evenings, properly, sitting in the Alcott parlor while Thomas Alcott read his paper with pointed and slightly theatrical unconcern, and he and Nora talked and played cards and argued about books, which was when she discovered that he read voraciously despite being a mountain man, or perhaps because of it, the long winter evenings in a one-room cabin being excellent motivation for the reading of whatever could be obtained. He showed her the scar in April because he wanted her to know the full extent of what the bear had done and what her actions had preserved. They were sitting on the porch of the house in the long spring evening, and he turned on the step and pulled his shirt aside from his shoulder, and she ran her fingers along the ridged white scar tissue from shoulder to hip with a care that was by then entirely familiar in a different way than it had been in October. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said, "in the cold. And the shoulder still pulls when I'm carrying a heavy pack over distance." "Will you always trap?" she asked. I think I will always go to the mountains, he said honestly. It is part of me. But I don't need to make it my entire life. A man can have more than one true thing. She understood what he was saying, and she felt the generosity of it and also the truth of it, and she said, I have always loved this country. I told myself when I was 14 that I didn't, but I was wrong. I love it. I would not want to leave it. Then we are agreed on that much, he said. He asked her to marry him in May, in the kitchen garden, in the spot where they had stood the previous October with their coffee cups looking at the mountains. He asked with a straightforwardness that was entirely like him, no theatrical arrangements, no performance, just his dark eyes on hers and his voice steady, and the weight of what he meant carried in every word. She said yes before he had finished asking, and the sound he made when she said it was low and warm and entirely unguarded, and she thought she would keep that sound in her chest for the rest of her life. Thomas Alcott, when told, was quiet for a considerable moment, and then he shook Elias Cole's hand and said, You will look after her. Yes, sir, Elias said. That is my intention. Thomas looked at his daughter. Are you happy? Yes, she said, and she was. The wedding was in June, in the small church on Ridgecrest's north end, officiated by Pastor Reynolds and attended by the whole of the town, because Ridgecrest was small enough and curious enough that a whole town wedding was not unusual when the story behind it was as good as this one. Nora wore her mother's dress, altered to fit, which was cream-colored and fine, and Elias Cole stood at the front of the church in the best clothes he owned and looked at her walking down the aisle with the expression of a man who is not entirely certain the good thing coming toward him is real. She was certain it was real. She had been certain since October. They exchanged the vows in the old words, in the voice of Pastor Reynolds reading from the Book of Common Prayer, and Elias Cole's hand was warm and very large around hers, and his voice, when he said the words, was low and steady and completely without doubt. After the ceremony, the whole town went to the meadow behind the church, because that was where the summer socials were held, and someone had brought fiddles, and there was food on long tables and the June light lasting late into the evening because the days were long, and Nora danced with her husband for the first time to a reel that the fiddlers played with more enthusiasm than precision. And she laughed, actually laughed, the way she had been laughing more often since spring, freely and without calculation. Elias danced because she wanted to dance, which she knew and which made her love him for it. And he was not an elegant dancer, but he was strong and capable of keeping the beat, and he held her with a certainty that she found she needed no translation for whatsoever. Her father danced with her once, in the old style, a slow and deliberate dance that was really just him holding her hands and turning, and he said quietly, Your mother would have liked him. I know, she said. I thought of that. He squeezed her hands and released her and went to get himself another cup of punch, and Nora looked across the meadow at her husband, who was in conversation with two of the cattlemen about something that required gestures toward the mountains, and the June evening light was golden, and the fiddles were going, and everything that had been uncertain for a year was certain now. They had a small house that Elias had rented through the spring, which was the Garvey cottage now that the Garveys had finished building on the north end of town. And it was not a large house, but it was solid and warm and had a kitchen garden already established and a view of the mountains from the back window that Nora had noted with considerable satisfaction the first time she saw it. They moved her things in the week before the wedding, and Elias had built new shelves in the main room for her books, which she had a good number of, and the shelves were straight and well made, which told her something about how he did everything. The summer settled them into the life they had been building toward, the daily, ordinary, particular life that is the real thing beneath all the large events. Elias took work where he could, helping with the late summer cattle drives and doing the kind of heavy labor that his size and capability made him the natural first choice for, hauling and building and clearing, and in the fall he took his trapping lines back into the mountains, but came back to Ridgecrest on a regular schedule now, every 2 or 3 weeks, so that the separation was a measured thing rather than an absolute one. Nora continued to help her father in the store, and she started keeping the accounts for 2 other businesses in town that needed someone with a head for numbers, and had discovered that she had one, and she built her own small place in the geography of Ridgecrest's community, The steady and reliable Nora Cole, who would tell you plainly what she thought and whose hands did not tighten when things were difficult. They had their first real argument in August about the length of the fall trapping season, which Elias wanted to extend, and Nora objected to on the grounds that the extension would take him past the time when the passes were reliably safe. They argued about it with the kind of honesty that comes from trusting each other enough to be fully direct, and the argument was not small. It involved raised voices and a door that was closed with more force than necessary, and an evening of very pointed silence. But they resolved it, because they were both people who would rather deal with a thing than let it grow, and the resolution was that Elias would cut the season where Nora specified, and that Nora would accept that a certain amount of risk was inherent in the life and was not something she could or should try to eliminate. "I'm not trying to make you into something you're not," she said, when they had gotten to the other side of it, sitting at the kitchen table in the evening. "I know that," he said, "and I'm not going to take unnecessary risks. I know what unnecessary looks like." She looked at him. "Yes. You know what it looks like on the trail, in the elements. Do you know what it looks like from here?" He was quiet. Then, "No, I don't have that reference. I need you to tell me." That was the thing about him that she had loved from very early on, the willingness to acknowledge what he did not know, the absence of false pride in the places where it would have been easiest and most understandable to have it. "Then I will tell you," she said, "and you will tell me when I'm overestimating the risk. We will work it out." "We will work it out," he agreed. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and that was the end of the argument and the beginning of an understanding that held through everything that came after. In October, the first anniversary of the meadow, Nora made coffee early in the morning, and they stood in the kitchen garden together, as they had stood the previous year, and looked at the mountains. "1 year," he said. "A year ago today I came around the corner of the meadow and found a man on his hands and knees in the grass bleeding on the ground," she said. "I was more dignified than that." "You were not," she said. He laughed, the low warm sound that was fully his own, and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into the solid weight of him, and the October mountains were the same gold and gray and permanent distance they had always been. "I am glad you came around that corner," he said. "I am extraordinarily glad I did," she said. He turned and kissed her temple, soft and deliberate, and her eyes closed for a moment against the morning light. The news came in November that she was expecting their first child, which she told Elias at dinner on a Tuesday evening, and the expression on his face was one of the finest things she had ever seen. A man completely ambushed by happiness, the careful self-containment going entirely in every direction at once. And he got up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair so that he was looking up at her. And he held her face in both his large and careful hands and did not say anything for a moment because he did not have words for it immediately and was not going to use inadequate ones. Then he said, "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "Do you need—" "Elias," she said gently, "I'm not made of glass. I'm strong and I'm healthy, and we are going to have a child, and you are going to build the new room you have been talking about since spring." He laughed, still holding her face. "I will start it this week." "Next week," she said. "It is November." "This week," he said firmly. "I will start the framing before the ground freezes." She looked at him, at the joy still plain and open on his face, and felt the answering joy in her own chest, full and steady and sure. "This week, then," she said. He built the room through November and into December, in the brief hours of daylight when the cold allowed it, and it was finished and tight and warm by Christmas, which was the first Christmas they had together, spent quietly with Thomas Alcott and a shared dinner that Thomas cooked badly and Nora corrected without comment. And the small house was warm and smelled of pine from the branches Elias had cut from the mountain and the wood smoke from the fire and the dinner. And Nora thought that this was what people meant when they talked about home, and had always felt she didn't quite understand. She understood it now. She understood it completely. The winter was long but not unkind that year, and Elias stayed close to Ridgecrest through the deep cold months, taking on work in town and coming home every evening, a pattern that suited them both in the particular way that things suit people who fit together well, the presence filling the house without crowding it, the evenings at the fire with books and conversation, and the comfortable small rituals of two people building a shared life. He checked the new room every day, as though verifying that it had not disappeared, which made her smile every time she saw him do it. He talked to her belly sometimes in the evenings, which she discovered accidentally when she came to the door of the bedroom and heard his voice, low and almost private, telling the child about the mountains, about the springs that came up clean from the rock, about the way the light looked in the high country in the early morning when everything was still. She stood in the doorway and listened until she was afraid she would cry, and then she went quietly back to the kitchen and stood by the stove for a moment, holding what she had heard. She told him she had heard later, because honesty between them had become both habit and religion. He was briefly embarrassed, which was rare for him and therefore endearing. "I thought you were asleep," he said. "I woke up," she said. "Don't stop. Whichever one of us it turns out to be, they will like to know about the mountains." "You're sure?" he said. "I am very sure," she said. "It is one of the finest things about you, Elias Cole." He looked at her with those dark eyes and the expression that she had learned to read fully now, the deep and unguarded regard, the thing he showed only her, and he said, "And you are one of the finest things about me." The baby came in late July in the heat of the summer, which was managed by Dr. Haynes and by Mrs. Reynolds, the pastor's wife, who was the town's unofficial midwife, and had brought enough children into the world to be unflappable. Elias was outside the bedroom door for the whole of it, which was the custom, and Nora could hear him out there, not pacing, but standing still, which was somehow more intense than pacing would have been. She did well. She had expected to do well, because she had her mother's constitution and her own determination, and the labor was long but not complicated. And when it was over and Mrs. Reynolds put the child in her arms, she looked at the red and astonished face of her son and felt something open in her chest that she did not have a previous name for. Elias was brought in when the room was put to rights, and he came to the bed and looked at the child in her arms with the expression of a man who is looking at something he knows will change everything and is grateful for the change. "A boy," she said. "A boy," he repeated in the low, wondering voice. "Do you want to hold him?" He reached out and she placed the child in his large hands, and the size of those hands made the infant look very small and very safe, and Elias Cole held his son with the careful competence of a man who had learned to handle fragile things without being diminished by their fragility, and he looked down at the baby with an expression of complete and undefended love. "Samuel," Nora said. She had thought about the name for months. Elias looked up at her. "Samuel," he said, trying it. "After your grandfather?" "After no one in particular," she said. "It just seems right for him." Elias looked back at the baby. "Hello, Samuel," he said, in the voice he had been using at the bedroom door all winter, the low, quiet voice meant for small and important things. The baby grabbed his finger with the mindless grip of the newborn, and Elias let out a breath that was almost a laugh, and Nora watched her husband fall absolutely and entirely in love with his son, and felt the happiness of it as something almost physical, warm through her whole body. Thomas Alcott came that afternoon, with his hat in his hands and his eyes somewhat brighter than usual, and he held his grandson with the stiffness of a man who had forgotten how to hold babies and was afraid to say so. And Nora showed him how to support the head, and he held Samuel for a long time, quietly, looking down at the small face with an expression she had not seen on his father's face since her mother had been alive. "He looks like your mother," Thomas said, "around the eyes." "I thought so too," Nora said. Samuel grew the way children grow in the West, in the way that country makes them strong and curious, and his father took him to the mountains for the first time at 3 years old, not high, just to the base of the foothills above the town. But Elias put him on the roan's back, and they rode up the trail until the trees got thick and the air changed, and Samuel's face, on the ride back, was the face of a child who has been shown something wonderful and is organizing his entire understanding of the world around it. Nora was expecting their second child by then, which she had told Elias in the same way she had told him the first time, at dinner on a Tuesday, and he had reacted in the same way. The ambushed happiness, the hands on her face, the declaration that the new room would need its own addition. The second child, a daughter, came in the spring, in the good spring weather that made everything feel possible, and they named her Clara, after no one in particular, because she looked like herself and no one else. Elias held Clara on the porch of the house the evening after she was born, in the April light, with Samuel sitting beside him on the porch step asking questions about why the baby's face looked like that. And Nora stood in the doorway watching the three of them and thought about the meadow, about the long September grass and the blood in the trail dust, and the moment she had seen the shape of him from the wagon. She thought about what a thin margin it was between the outcome she was standing in and the outcome that would have been if she had taken a different road, if she had been earlier or later, if she had not stopped. She had thought about it many times over the years, not with dread but with a kind of clear-eyed gratitude that she tried to keep honest, not the sentimental gratitude of someone making meaning from luck, but the practical gratitude of someone who understands that some things do not have to be lost. He caught her looking, the way he often did, and the look he gave her across the porch in the spring evening was the look she knew better than she knew almost any other thing, steady and warm and entirely certain, the look of a man who knew exactly where he was and was not in any doubt about how he felt about it. She came out onto the porch and sat beside him, and he shifted Clara to one arm and put the other around Nora's shoulders, and Samuel leaned against his father's leg and looked at the mountains that were still white on their upper reaches but greening at the base, and the four of them were quiet together in the way of people who have earned their quiet. The years that followed built themselves on the foundation they had laid, good solid years of the kind that do not make dramatic stories but are the actual substance of a life. Elias continued to trap in the falls and winters, but always within the range he and Nora had agreed on, and he came back on schedule, and the 2 weeks or 3 that he was gone in the mountains were marked in the house by the particular quality of his absence, the way good things make you aware of themselves by their absence as much as their presence. He brought the mountains home with him every time, the smell of pine and cold air and wood smoke in his clothes, the careful descriptions of what he had seen, told to Samuel and Clara at dinner with the same quiet specificity that he had used when talking to them before they could understand words, as if the mountains were a member of the family who deserved to be properly introduced. Samuel, at 6, announced that he intended to be a mountain man like his father. Elias received this news with the seriousness it deserved, which meant not laughing and not dismissing it, and not projecting his own experience onto it. "You'll need to learn first," Elias said. "Teach me," Samuel said. "Some of it," Elias said. "The rest the mountains will teach you themselves." Nora watched this exchange from the kitchen and decided to let the men of the family sort out the mountain question, because she trusted Elias to be both honest and safe about it, and he was. He taught Samuel the things a boy could learn, the tracking and the weather reading and the names of plants and the behavior of animals, and he taught him to respect the country rather than fear it or be reckless in it, which was the most important lesson and the hardest one to teach, because it required understanding rather than rules. Clara, at 4, wanted nothing to do with the mountains and everything to do with the kitchen and with her grandfather's store, where she appointed herself assistant from the age at which she could reach the counter and kept a careful and largely imaginary account of the inventory in a small notebook that Thomas Alcott bought her specifically for this purpose, because he recognized in her the same organizational precision that had made her mother the best accounts keeper in Ridgecrest. Thomas Alcott, in his late 60s, was more present in their lives than he had been in Nora's girlhood, which was the way of grandparents who discover in grandchildren what was sometimes obscured in their relationship with their own children. He came to dinner on Sundays without fail, and he played cards with Elias on the evenings that Nora attended the women's sewing circle, which she had joined primarily because it was where the actual news of the town was exchanged, and the two men had arrived at the kind of mutual respect that had been a calculation at first and was now something more genuine, built from shared meals and shared work and the shared project of being important to the same people. There was a particular evening in the fall of that 4th year when the children were 4 and 2 and asleep in their room, and Thomas had gone home and the fire was burning low in the main room, when Elias put his book down and looked at Nora across the room with the expression that still undid her, after 4 years, with the same completeness it had the first time she had seen it fully. "What is it?" she said. Nothing, he said. I was thinking. About what? He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire, and then he said, That September morning, the Grizzly. She set her own book down. What about it? I've thought about it a number of times, he said, trying to understand exactly what happened. Not the attack, the afterward, the 5 miles I walked. He paused. I have been in difficult country my entire adult life. I have been lost and I have been cold, and I have been hurt in smaller ways a dozen times. And every time there has been the possibility of simply lying down and letting it be finished. Every man in the mountains comes to that understanding at some point. The country is very indifferent to whether you continue. She was listening to him with her full attention. That morning, he said, when I got to the meadow and went down on my knees, I thought that might be it. I thought, with something very close to acceptance, that it might be finished. He looked at her. And then I heard the wagon. And I thought, no, not yet. Why? She said softly. I did not know why at the time, he said. I just knew it very clearly. Not yet. He paused. I think I know why now. She stood up and crossed the room to him, and he shifted on the chair so that she could sit on the arm of it beside him, and she put her arm around his shoulders, the strong, familiar weight of him beneath her arm, the old scar tissue she knew by touch. You, he said. The answer is you. But I did not know that yet, obviously. I did not know you yet. And yet I knew not yet. He looked at the fire. I have thought about that a great deal. What it means that a man can know a thing before he knows the reason. I think sometimes we know what we need before we know what it is, she said. Yes, he said. That's it exactly. She rested her head against his, and the fire settled in the grate, and outside the autumn wind moved through the cottonwood trees, and in the back of the house their children slept in the room he had built before the first of them was born, and the mountains outside the town were dark and enormous and quietly present, the same mountains they had looked at together in the kitchen garden on the morning he had told her what he wanted. I would have died in that meadow, he said. It was not self-pity, just the simple statement of a man who understood the mechanics of survival. Without you, I would have died in that meadow. I know, she said. Nora, he said. Yes, she said, before he had finished whatever he was going to say, because she already knew, and because some words do not require the question to have the answer. He turned his head and kissed her, and she kissed him back in the way she always did, fully and without reservation, and outside, the wind was picking up with the scent of the first early snow coming down from the peaks. And the fire was warm, and the house was exactly what a house is supposed to be, the place where the most important things happen without any fanfare, and without any audience, and without any need for either. A third child came the following spring, another boy, born in the same room as his brother and sister, in the same good, uncomplicated way, delivered by the same Mrs. Reynolds, who was by now something between a midwife and a family friend. They named him Thomas, after Nora's father, who received the news of it with a composure that he managed to maintain for about 30 seconds before removing himself to the kitchen garden under the pretext of checking the early lettuce. When he came back in, his eyes were red at the corners and his composure was entirely restored. Thomas, Elias said, with the serious nod of a man who considers names to be commitments. Good name. Thomas Alcott shook his son-in-law's hand and then pulled him briefly into an embrace that surprised them both, and was immediately followed by the older man straightening his coat and making a comment about the quality of the window glass. And Elias caught Nora's eye over her father's head, and she saw in his expression an affection for the old man that was entirely real and entirely mutual. And she thought that this, too, had been built slowly, without announcement, in the way of all the best things. Samuel, at 5, inspected his new brother with the critical eye of a child who has been promised something and is verifying the quality of the delivery. He is very small, he said. You were very small once, Nora said. I don't remember that, Samuel said. Take my word for it, said his father. Samuel considered this. Will he be able to climb when he gets bigger? When he gets bigger, Elias said, I expect he will climb anything he can find. Samuel found this satisfactory and went to investigate the kitchen. Clara, who was 3, climbed onto the bed beside her mother, and looked at the new baby with an expression that was simultaneously proprietary and tender. She reached out one small finger and touched the baby's hand, very gently, and the baby's fingers closed around hers with the same mindless grip that had caught his father's finger 4 years earlier. Clara looked up at her mother. "He can stay," she said. "Thank you," Nora said. The life they had built kept building. Ridgecrest grew slowly, the way frontier towns grow, by the accumulation of people and stories and small, inevitable changes, new buildings on the main street, and a schoolhouse finally established in the year that Samuel was ready for it, which Nora had helped petition for alongside 3 other mothers who had opinions about the education of their children and the means to be persistent about them. Elias had helped build the schoolhouse naturally, because there was heavy work to be done and he was available, and because the cause of his children's education was one he held alongside his wife with perfect alignment. There were injustices in that territory, as there were everywhere in the West, and they were not invisible to either of them. The land that had been the Ute people's for generations before any settlers arrived had been reduced and reshaped by treaties that the government made and broke with a regularity that was discussed in Ridgecrest only obliquely, when discussed at all. Elias had lived in the mountains long enough to understand what that displacement meant in practical terms, the disruption of ways of life that had evolved over centuries to work in harmony with the land. And he talked about it honestly when it came up, which was not always welcome in a town that preferred to focus on its own development without too close an examination of whose development that came at the expense of. Nora had her own views, shaped by observation and by the same clear-eyed refusal to look away from what was real that governed everything about her, and their dinner-table conversations, once the children were old enough, were not sanitized ones. Samuel grew up understanding that the country he was learning to love was complicated, that it had been shaped by both beauty and injustice, and that understanding that did not require either gratitude or guilt, but did require honesty. In the fall of the 5th year, Elias took Samuel on his first overnight in the mountains, not high, well below the tree line, just one night on the trail with a small fire, and the stars above the aspen canopy and the sounds of the night country that Samuel had been waiting his whole small life to hear. They came back the next afternoon, Samuel talking faster than he had talked about anything before, his eyes bright with it, and Nora stood on the porch and watched her son describe his night in the mountains to his grandfather and his sister and his baby brother, with the passionate specificity of someone who has received an important gift and needs to make sure others understand its value. Elias came to stand beside her on the porch. He smelled of wood smoke and pine, the mountain smell she had associated with him since the beginning. "How did he do?" she asked quietly. "Better than I did my first time," Elias said. "He listens. He was afraid of the sounds in the night and he didn't pretend he wasn't. Just listened until he figured out what they were." She looked at her husband. "That's exactly what you would do." "Yes," he said, with a satisfaction that was not pride in himself but in his son, the particular and profound satisfaction of a parent who sees their best qualities reflected forward. She took his hand. He held it. Below the porch, Samuel was now reenacting some aspect of the night involving considerable sound effects, and Clara was watching him with the expression of a person being slightly entertained despite themselves. And Thomas, 2 years old, was attempting to eat a small quantity of the yard dirt and was being monitored but not actively prevented by his grandfather, who had developed a pragmatic philosophy about the edibility of small amounts of clean soil. The mountains were going gold and red behind them, the fall colors at their peak, and the afternoon was cooling in the particular clean way of Colorado autumn, and Elias turned and kissed her temple in the same spot he had kissed it the first October morning in the garden, soft and deliberate, and she closed her eyes for a moment against the light. "It has been a good life," he said quietly, the statement of a man taking stock. "It is a good life," she corrected, with the gentle precision of someone who objects to the past tense being applied to something still fully present. He smiled. "It is a good life," he agreed. She leaned against him, into the solid warmth of him, her husband, the mountain man she had found bleeding in a meadow 5 years ago and had not left. And he put his arm around her and held her the way he always held her, with a certainty that she had never once had to doubt, and they watched their children in the yard in the fall light of the Colorado afternoon. And the mountains were immense and patient and beautiful behind them, and the story of how they had come to be standing here together was one their children would hear in pieces over the years. The grizzly and the meadow and the wagon and the long drive to Ridgecrest, the spare room and the coffee in the kitchen garden, and the spring when he came back earlier than expected. Samuel would be the one who asked the most questions about it, which was Samuel's nature, and he would ask them of both his parents separately, comparing the answers, interested in the texture of each version. He would ask his father once, when he was old enough to understand what he was asking, what it had felt like to be lying in the meadow when he understood he could not get up. Elias would think about this for a long moment, the same way he thought about everything that mattered. "It felt like the end of a sentence," he would say, "and then your mother drove around the corner and it turned out to be a comma." Samuel would not entirely understand this, being 10 years old, but he would remember it. He would remember it for the rest of his life, actually, and would repeat it to his own children one day, in his own time, in a world they could not yet imagine from this porch in Ridgecrest in the fall of 1879. For now, he was 6 years old and describing a night in the mountains to everyone in the yard, and his father was holding his mother on the porch, and the mountains were gold and red and going to blue in the deepening afternoon, and in the house behind them there was a fire laid and a dinner to be made, and 3 children to be put to bed, and a whole evening ahead of the particular quiet happiness that does not announce itself, that simply is, in the way that the best and most durable things simply are. Nora looked out at the mountains and thought, as she sometimes did, about the woman she had been before that September morning, the careful and somewhat frustrated woman in the dry goods store who was going to be arranged into a life she had not chosen. And she thought about how strange and precise the mercy had been, the grizzly on the trail, the blood in the dust, the man on his knees in the long grass, the wagon coming around the corner of the meadow. Strange and precise and, in the end, exactly right. She tightened her hand around her husband's, and he tightened his around hers, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying, and the mountains held their long and patient and magnificent silence, and the world went on.